The rain came down in thick silver sheets over the compound in Ramadi. It was a rare, violent downpour that turned the dust to mud and made the world smell of wet concrete and cordite. Inside the cramped makeshift aid station, the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the low hum of a generator struggling against the humidity. The men of SEAL Team 3, Task Unit Bruiser, were packed into the space, their usual bravado dampened by the grim task at hand. And they had just returned from a complex ambush. It had been a bad one. 2 operators from a sister squadron were down, and the medevac was delayed by the storm. The team was silent, a rare occurrence, their eyes fixed on the 2 litters where their fallen brothers lay. The corpsman working on them was a slight figure, swallowed by the bulk of her tactical vest. Her name was Hannah. For the last 8 months, she had been attached to their unit, a quiet, efficient presence who kept their sinuses clear in the cold and their wounds sealed in a firefight. To them, she was Doc, a crucial component of the machine, but still an outsider in the fraternity of the teams. Tonight, that perception was about to be shattered. Lieutenant Commander Miller, a man with a voice like gravel, watched as Hannah moved. There was no panic in her movements, only a terrifying economy. She moved between the 2 wounded men, her gloved hands steady as she assessed. I packed wounds and called out vitals in a voice that cut through the chaos. One man, Petty Officer 2nd Class Danvers, had a sucking chest wound. The other, Senior Chief Reynolds, had catastrophic hemorrhaging from a femoral artery. "Danvers first," Miller barked, his instinct to prioritize the most fixable. Hannah didn't even look up. "Negative. Senior's bleeding out. 30 seconds and he's done." Her tone wasn't disrespectful. It was absolute. It was the voice of someone who had made this calculation before, in a place far worse than this. Miller opened his mouth to countermand her, a lifetime of command instinct flaring, but the look in her eyes when she glanced up stopped him cold. It wasn't the look of a support element. It was the look of a predator who knew the terrain of death better than he did. She worked on Reynolds first, her fingers finding the torn artery with a precision that seemed almost clairvoyant. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, applying direct pressure with a strength that belied her frame. "Tourniquet high and tight," she ordered to the operator beside her, who fumbled for a moment before complying. The bleeding slowed. It didn't stop, but it slowed. Without a pause, she shifted to Danvers. She tore open his jacket, revealing the wound. She didn't reach for a standard chest seal. Instead, her hand went to a small pocket on her vest, and pulling out a piece of equipment Miller had never seen a field corpsman carry. It was a narrow, flexible tube with a one-way valve, a makeshift thoracostomy kit, but more primitive. It looked like something you'd rig in a jungle, not carry in a modern war zone. As she worked, inserting the tube into Danvers's chest cavity to relieve the pressure that was collapsing his lung, the air left the room again. The sound of the rain, the generator, everything faded. And the entire unit was watching her hands. They moved with a muscle memory that wasn't learned in a simulation or a field hospital. This was the muscle memory of survival. It was Ensign Matthews, the youngest of the team, who broke the silence. He was staring at a faded tattoo on Hannah's forearm, partially obscured by her rolled-up sleeve. It was a crudely inked compass rose, but the North Star was replaced by a stylized tiger. "Doc," he whispered, his voice full of a dawning, awful respect. "Where'd you learn to do that? That's not standard issue." Hannah didn't answer. She was focused on Danvers's breathing, listening for the telltale sign of air moving correctly. When she was satisfied, she finally sat back on her heels. The immediate crisis was averted, at least for now. The rain continued its assault on the tin roof. She looked at Matthews, then at the rest of the men who were staring at her. She saw the question in their eyes. For 8 months, they had been polite, and professional, but protective. They saw her as someone to be shielded, a non-combatant in their world of violence. She had let them believe it. It was easier that way. It kept the questions at bay, but the technique she had just used, the callous prioritization, the utter lack of hesitation, it didn't belong to a corpsman who had only ever treated blisters and gunshot wounds from a safe distance. "Liberia," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. 2003. The word hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Liberia. It wasn't a theater any of them had operated in. It was a different kind of war altogether, a humanitarian crisis that had devolved into a meat grinder. Miller leaned forward. "You were a contractor? NGO?" She shook her head, wiping blood from her hands with a sterile wipe. "No, sir. I was 15. The generator coughed, and for a second, the lights dimmed. And the silence that followed was so complete, they could hear the individual droplets of rain hitting the sandbags outside. Hannah didn't look at them. She looked at Reynolds, whose face was pale, but whose pulse was now steady under her fingers. She spoke to him, but her words were for everyone. "My mother was an American aid worker. My father was Liberian, a doctor. When the war came to our town, the fighters, they didn't see a doctor. They saw a resource. They took him. They took his clinic. They took everything." She paused, adjusting the IV drip. "My mother and I hid for 3 days in a false ceiling above a church. When we came down, the town was gone. So was he." Matthews swallowed hard. "How did you—" "I survived," she said simply. "You find a way, or you don't. A group of women took us in. They were hiding in the bush, trying to protect their children. The fighters found them. They did what fighters do. I was small. I hid in a hollow log. When they left, I was the only one left. I was 10. The operators shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't a war story from a bar. This was a confession. "I stayed in the bush," she continued. "I learned the sounds. I learned the smells. I learned how to be invisible. After a while, I came across a group of people, not soldiers, not rebels, just people trying to get to the border. An old man was with them. He'd stepped on a landmine. He was dying slowly in the mud, and no one knew what to do. They were just watching him die." She finally looked up, her eyes meeting Miller's. "I remembered watching my father. I remembered his hands. I found a piece of rubber tubing, a sharpened piece of metal, some cleanish cloth from a dead woman's dress. I tied off his leg. I cut away the ruined flesh. I cauterized the wound with hot coals from a fire pit. He lived. He made it to the border." She looked back down at her patient. "After that, I wasn't invisible anymore. Word spread. In a war zone, it's a 10-year-old girl who can stop the bleeding is a miracle or a curse. People found me. The wounded, the sick, the children with fevers, the women who'd been torn. I learned. Every day I learned. I learned how to set bones with sticks, how to treat infections with boiled tree bark, how to deliver a baby when the mother was dying. I was their doctor. I was 11. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle. No one in the room moved. For 5 years, that was my life. I patched up whoever they brought me. Rebels, government soldiers, children, it didn't matter. If you were bleeding, I fixed you. That's how I stayed alive. They protected me because they needed me. But I never forgot. I kept a list in my head. The men who took my father. The men who killed the women in the bush. I knew their faces. I knew their scars. I knew their names." Her voice hardened, just a fraction. "When I was 14, a man came to my camp. He was a fighter, a commander. He had a bullet wound in his shoulder. He was one of them, the one who had led the raid on our town." The tension in the room was a physical force. They knew what was coming. "I fixed him," Hannah said. "I took the bullet out. I sewed him up. I gave him medicine for the fever. He thanked me. He called me his little angel. He stayed for 3 days, recovering. On the third night, he was sleeping. I took his own knife and I cut his throat. She said it with the same clinical detachment she used to describe a wound. I didn't feel anything. Not then. Not now. I went back to patching people up. That was my life until a UN patrol found our camp when I was 16. They couldn't believe it. A child, running a field hospital. They got me out. They found my mother's family in the States. I went to live with an aunt I'd never met. I finished high school in 2 years. I went to nursing school. I joined the Navy. I became a medic. She finally stopped, her hands resting on Reynolds's chest. I've been running from that girl for a long time, but she's still here. She's the one who knows how to save you when no one else can. She looked around the room at the hardened SEALs who had seen and done things that would break normal men. They looked back at her, and for the first time, they didn't see the unit's doc. They saw a survivor. And they saw a warrior who had been forged in a fire so hot it made their own training seem like a summer camp. The respect in their eyes was different now. It was deeper, more primal. It was the respect one apex predator has for another, even if she wears a different skin. Just then, the distant thump of rotors broke the silence. The medevac was finally coming through the weather. As the sound grew louder, the men sprang into practiced action, preparing to move the wounded. But as they lifted the litters, each man made a point of brushing past Hannah, a quick touch on the shoulder, a nod of the head. It was a silent acknowledgement, a welcome into a brotherhood she had already earned 1,000 times over. Miller was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looking back at her. She was cleaning her instruments, her face once again an impassive mask. The blood on her uniform was already turning brown. "Doc," he said, his voice gruff. "For what it's worth, you're not running anymore. You're home." He didn't wait for a reply. He stepped out into the rain, leaving her alone in the dim light of the aid station. The generator hummed. The rain fell. And for the first time in over 2 decades, the girl in the hollow log, the child doctor of the Liberian bush, the woman who had just laid her soul bare before a group of warriors, allowed herself a single shuddering breath that was not quite a sob, but the closest thing to it she had felt in a very long time. The silence of the unit wasn't one of shock anymore. It was one of profound, unshakable respect. They had unveiled her past, and in doing so, had found one of their own.